again. My name's Carolyn King. I'm a co-host tonight with Andrew Stone Porter, and we are having our second emerging conversation on alternatives to violent policing. This is the second of a series of 3, and it's sponsored by El Surge Faith, the Interfaith Coalition for Immigrant Justice, and Sowers of Justice. We'll be having our third conversation on November the 12th at 7 p.m. The series are about leaning into conversations around community safety, and particularly because we are faith-oriented groups, how they relate to faith communities. We explore current issues around increasingly militarized policing, current realities where many in our communities don't feel safe and secure and don't trust our public institutions to help them. So these events are spaces for us to dream about what a safe community means for everyone and to look for emerging models of how we can make communities better and safe communities a reality. So we are happy that you're with us tonight. We don't have time to have everyone introduce themselves, but we do hope you'll use the chat function and give us your name. And if you are involved with the faith community, put down what faith community you are involved with. If you're not, that's fine. It's not a requirement to be here, but we would like to know. Also with the chat function, if you want to enter things as we go along, just to give some insights or reflection on what people are saying, it's a good way that we can share our thoughts with each other without maybe interrupting speakers or things like that. So I'm going to turn the program over to Andrew now, and he will talk about the agenda and take us to the next step. Thank you.
Thanks, Carolyn, and thanks everybody for being here tonight. As Carolyn said, I'm going to take us briefly through our agenda. We have the wonderful opportunity to hear from a stacked panel tonight of amazing community leaders. Tonight we're going to hear from Chandra Cruz Thompson, Representative Charles Booker, Keturah Herron, and Rashaad Abdur-Rahman. Each of these conversation leaders will speak in turn about 5 to 7 minutes each. And we are trying to respect everybody's time tonight and make sure that we can close as close to 8:30 as possible, because we know we're all champing at the bit to watch a presidential debate at 9 p.m. That's going to be much less interesting than what we're about to find out tonight. So, but we do want to try and keep the time if we can. Around 7:50, we should be moving on to our breakout groups, which is the next session. The breakout groups will be an invitation for us to reflect back together in conversation about some of the themes that our conversation leaders have raised for us. So we'll have about 20-25 minutes in which the participants will be basically sent off to a breakout room. There'll be one of our conversation leaders and a facilitator present in the group, and we'll discuss a question about imagining alternatives to violent policing. And then finally, we'll come back in the room. We'll share some salient insights that came up in the breakout sessions, and we'll close it tight from there. Now I'd like to introduce our first, well, not our first speaker, but Tricia Lloyd-Seidel, who's going to introduce our evening tonight in a prayerful way. So Tricia is part of the leadership team of Louisville's Interfaith Coalition for Immigrant Justice, as well as El Surge Faith. She worked for decades in ecumenical and international work and now focuses her energy locally. So Tricia, I hand it over to you. Thanks.
Thank you. Good evening, friends. I'm really glad to be here with all of you. We are from all different communities. We share a passion for justice, and I hope this speaks to all of you, however you identify faith-wise. Civil rights lawyer, filmmaker, and activist Valerie Kaur struck a deep chord of longing in many with a question she posed in a TED Talk in 2017 in the context of escalating hatred and violence. She asked, what if this darkness is not the darkness of the tomb, but the darkness of the womb? What if our America is not dead, but a country that is waiting to be born? Kaur believes that we are called to give birth to a future where love is a force for justice. Her vision of love is rooted in the Sikh faith tradition and her experience as a woman. Love, she says, is sweet labor, fierce, bloody, imperfect, life-giving. When we labor in love in a time of rage, love becomes revolutionary. Like many love-filled activists, Kaur stands on the shoulders of Black feminist bell hooks, who has long envisioned a world where the love ethic is a foundation for all arenas of society. Bell Hooks is a cultural critic, a professor, and an activist who has written over 30 books, including one called All About Love, New Visions. Love, she insists, is a verb. Love is an action, never simply a feeling. Love must be reclaimed from its individualistic, feeling-centered captivity. For many of us, reclaiming love requires unlearning deeply entrenched habits acquired in our religious communities. I recently came across this quote: if we had been holier people, we would have been angrier oftener. Knowing little about the man who was quoted, except that he was a philanthropist, I Googled John Templeton and discovered that we share a Presbyterian heritage. Like me, Templeton must have learned at home and in church to avoid open conflict, to value logic over emotion, especially messy emotions like anger. In white faith communities, we have long avoided open expressions of anger in our insistence on being comfortable. And we are slow to recognize this as part and parcel of cultural racism that not only perpetuates white power, but also shrinks our hearts and limits our vision. Working for justice is uncomfortable, untidy, confusing, and even dangerous. As we seek to participate in undoing racism and oppression, we have important inner work to do. As Andrew Stone Porter reminded us in our first emerging conversation, I know that I must attend to my own multi-layered mix of anger, complicity, fear, perfectionism, privilege, and more. In the same way, collectively, we need to grapple with the many ways that white supremacy culture shows up in our faith and activist communities. And to make sure that we don't fall into the trap of wanting and waiting to get it right before acting, we have bell hooks to remind us that love is an act of will, requiring both intention and action. And Valerie Kaur to remind us that the labor for justice has gone on for centuries before us, and it will continue for centuries after us. Now is our time to root ourselves in love as we reimagine safety and security in our communities. Let's go to work.
Thank you, Tricia. Okay, I'm going to be introducing the conversation leaders, and the questions that they're going to be addressing when they talk with us are, number one, what are some alternatives they are aware of to violent policing? Have they seen any of these alternatives in their personal experience, in their own communities? Have they seen them at work? And how do they envision these or other alternatives being implemented on a broader scale? So when we talk about violent policing too, we're talking about systems. We're not just talking about police forces, we're talking about militarized entities that include Border Patrol, ICE, other DHS forces, sheriffs, and state police as well. So keep this, as broad, but speak to us from your own experience with this. Our first conversation leader is Chandra Cruz Thompson, an organizer and a member of Mijente, Louisville. Chandra is a queer disabled Chicanics community organizer, storyteller, and budding herbalist. They support protests with art, supplies, graphic design, and social media amplification, and mentor youth organizers. Chandra was a lead organizer in the successful campaign to stop the 2020 anti-immigrant legislation, Kentucky Senate Bill 1. Welcome, Chandra, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks. I wrote down some notes, so I'm going to be looking down periodically, so just bear with me. But there's some things that I want to ground us in before I talk a little bit about what I've seen as alternatives to violent policing and how I think we can grow that. And so, I guess part of being able to grow these alternatives is being able to be in deeper community with your people, your neighbors, whoever you consider to be your community. And really being able to recognize that state-endorsed policing entities will not help the situation you're trying to address. Or if they help you, they're doing it at the expense of the people they deem less worthy of protection. So part of these are some psychological reckonings that we need to have in order to really grow these alternatives to policing. So if you have a problem that you would have ordinarily called the police to help you with, and you just take that off the table, don't even consider calling the cops as an option. Ask yourself what skills and tools you and your community have to address the situation. Often we feel like we don't have the time or resources to address our own needs, let alone our communities. So instead of helping a disabled, houseless person in a wheelchair who has tipped over get upright and ask them what they need, we call the cops. Or instead of using transformative justice skills to de-escalate a physically violent situation, we call the cops. Not calling the cops requires us to slow down and collectively build our skill sets in order to transform community problems. It requires us to get in touch with and process our emotions in healthier ways, not stifle them. Capitalism and colonialism ask us to not take the time to be in deeper relationship and build community skills together. So growing into abolition means growing into decolonization as well. So that being said, some of the work that I have seen as alternatives, it's all community work. So the people that I've been in community with, when we have had issues that we need to address, we solve them as a community. There was somebody who had a bomb go off in her garage, and a community came together to do a circling around the block situation, practically 24/7 for the length of time that was deemed necessary, instead of calling the cops, because the cops certainly didn't care. They had escalated the situation to begin with. The group of people I'm currently organizing during this uprising is with this group called Collective Liberation Network. And our approach has really been, what are the mutual aid things that we need to organize to empower people to be out in the streets protesting? And what are the community things that we need to organize to help meet people's basic needs that they aren't otherwise getting from the state? So for example, we're providing home cooked meals to one another. We're providing rides for one another. We're providing emergency evacuations when people are at protests and the cops are coming in heavy. And we're providing jail support. We have a hotline. We have on the ground jail support. And we're providing like free graphic design to whoever needs like a flyer made but doesn't have the time to make it. So we're doing that, everything for free, and just whatever people have the skills to provide, we're just giving them like space and an organizing atmosphere to be able to like come together in a mutual aid, like grand scale pod, to be able to provide that for one another in the community. And that often means when our basic needs are met, like we don't even have to get to the point where somebody is in such crisis that somebody else is considering calling the cops. So, I mean, yeah, I think that's kind of my basic spiel, is that like essentially it's just, what are you willing to reprioritize in your life to give yourself the time that you're going to need to address a situation one-on-one with another community member? What are you going to reprioritize in your life so that you start building the skill set and resources with your community when cops are no longer an option? So everything that you would have called the cops for before, if they're no longer an option, it's up to us to build up those skills and those resources instead. And it's up to us to take the time to do that. So reprioritizing, uplifting the people that white supremacy oppresses, that cops act as an agent to oppress, and finding your skills with your community of what you can provide to show up in the situation.
Thank you very much, Chandra. Those are good points, and I know your discussion group will take that a lot further along as well. Thank you. Our second speaker is Charles Booker. Charles represents the 43rd District in the Kentucky House of Representatives. He was a candidate for the U.S. Senate earlier this year and made a good run. Continues to channel his vision to eliminate structural inequality as the founder and director of Hood to the Holler. Thank you, Charles.
Good evening, and thank you for having me. I want to first of all lift up Chandra, who just gave some very important remarks. I'm very honored to be on this panel and want to do a lot of listening and learning, as I've been for the past few years with several of the folks on this panel. Thank you for bringing this conversation together. What policing and how we address violent policing means to me is, first of all, understanding some foundational aspects of it. When we talk about violence in our city, in our community, police violence is a part of that. We often separate it out and put it in a different bucket and excuse it away, but it is indeed violence. And so when we understand that and we step back and embrace this bigger conversation that you all have been lifting up and will continue to do so around treating violence as a public health crisis, it requires us to leverage all of the components of community, which is essentially what Chandra was mentioning, is that we're talking about how we create a rich, vibrant, well-resourced, thriving spirit of community that is reinforced by our policies. It's reinforced by our budgetary decisions, and ultimately creates a space of generational enrichment and empowerment that ends poverty, that ends inequity, that pulls up the roots of racism. All of that is what we talk about when we are discussing police violence, because again, it is a comprehensive thing. And so what that means for me is us investing in people, investing in the communities that have been marginalized and therefore criminalized, like mine in the West End, for generations. It requires us to understand that the investments that we make in our infrastructure, in the sense of neighborhood authority in terms of supporting neighborhood associations, watch groups, true community policing, all of these things, and then also realizing that we haven't invested in our systems that determine what outputs we get in our communities. So realizing this is a structural conversation, how have we invested in education to make sure that it is not a pipeline to prison? How do we make sure we're investing in economic opportunities and ownership and wealth creation in every community so that there are pathways for folks to live gainful lives. And then on the other end of that, since we haven't been doing that, and we've been criminalizing targeted behaviors that we deem to be out of order or out of compliance or unruly, and a lot of that goes back to a history of maintaining white supremacy, as you've laid out, is realizing that we've taken away opportunities from communities. They are fighting for survival. We are fighting for survival and being criminalized because of it. Even the conversation about cannabis and the war on drugs and the ill effects of what that has meant for marginalized communities, Black and brown communities. And so all of this is the conversation of how we address violent policing, because when communities are healthy and thriving in a comprehensive way, you're not seeing violence. Violence is a result of pain and trauma. Violence is a result of a lot of needs that aren't being met. I've had 5 cousins murdered the last 4 years. And in each instance, I've stepped back to assess what was happening around the moments when my cousins were taken away. And I talk about TJ a lot. I keep his dog tag in my pocket. I'm holding it right now. When TJ was murdered, it was by a young guy that at first I was really, really mad at. And I met his family. And in learning about his lived experiences that were very similar to mine, the trauma that he had, it was very similar to what I'm well aware of. I realized that he was hurting and he was broken well before he killed my cousin. And if we don't deal with those things, we are not going to be able to cure violence, as some would say. So the way that I've seen it implemented, and it has been, is when we support communities that are thriving, and it's happened in and throughout the West End, because a lot of times these conversations find their ways back to where I live. Neighborhood associations, and I'll tell you, they've been anchors for a long time. We would have groups of stewards in the communities that would monitor their own blocks and would call one another if something happened, and then would convene as a body to determine what actions needed to be taken, well before LMPD showed up. And even if you look at the spirit of the protests now, take away how they've been defined by bigger narratives that don't care about justice. So don't deal with the rioting and looting and all those inflammatory things that aren't true if you're actually on the ground. What you will see when people are hurting and acting out of their pain and trauma, sometimes even irrationally, before law enforcement come in and shoot pepper bullets and flashbang and whatever, you will see folks around them love on them and calm them down and bring them back and say, this is why we have to continue fighting, and I love you and I understand. That is the sense of community that we have to invest in more. And it is possible in Louisville. And in fact, we are going to do it. And I'll tee it up a little bit, but I'm working as we speak to really take this conversation we're having now and to bring more comprehensive folks to the table from leadership, local, state, federal level, and grassroots in the community, from neighborhood base as well. I've talked to some of you all that are part of this about how we can create a model of community policing that is holistic, that is then reinforced by our budget, our city budget, that will allow for ambassadors in their own neighborhoods to monitor trash and to deal with conflict resolution, because we often assign police to do all of that stuff and they're not trained for it. It's putting them in harm's way, and it's definitely putting us in harm's way. And so it is possible. And I believe conversations like this, where we're being transparent and introspective, are a big part of how we're going to get there. So I'm proud to be a part of this.
Thank you very much, Charles. And thanks for reminding us that hurt people, and communities can help with that. Okay, our next speaker is Keturah Herron. She's a policy strategist with the ACLU of Kentucky and a member of Black Lives Matter. Keturah is a change agent with over 15 years experience working with youth and families involved in the social service and the criminal justice systems. Her focus now is on policy change through a social justice lens. Keturah was instrumental in researching and drafting Breonna's law to ban no-knock warrants, enacted by Metro Council in June. Thank you, Keturah.
Thank you all for having me, and thanks to the audience members who have tuned in. And Chandra and Representative Booker have said some wonderful things, and I'm nodding my head and also taking notes. So I thank you all for that. And I look forward to what Rashaad has to say as well. The first thing I want to just lift up is just, I just want folks to understand that the national uprising for racial justice that we're seeing right now is the largest social movement in the United States history. And it is clear that the majority of us want to live in a world that is free from the dominance of white supremacy. We have to learn different ways to be in relationship with each other. And white supremacy has taught us violence. And it goes all the way back from the Native genocide to slavery to now prisons and mass incarceration. And it has taught us that vengeance is the way to solve problems. But it should be noted that our problems are because of the minority. And when I say the minority, I mean our elected officials, that they concentrate their power by concentrating and creating scarcity for us. And as Charles and Chandra both hit on, that we have to not invest in policing, that our elected officials, they invest in policing rather than systems that meet the needs of the people that we love. And so I want to tell a really quick story. A couple of months ago, may have been earlier this year, I was driving down 15th and Oak, and while I was there, I saw an older Black gentleman who appeared to possibly be houseless, also appeared to have some type of mental health issues. And we drove up, we were just driving, and this man had his pants to his ankles and he was exposed. And I rolled the window down and I was like, "Hey, sir, how you doing?" Very friendly. And I said, "You should probably pull your pants up," trying to assist and help him. And what he said to me was, "Mind your business." And I just laughed and was like, "Yeah, you're right. I should mind my business." And so we just drove off, and I was very scared and fearful for him. I wanted to call someone to assist him, but I knew that I couldn't call the police due to what that interaction could possibly be. But I wish that there was some type of number that I could have dialed, that someone could have aided him and who would have been better equipped to deal with him and help him in that moment. And so I've started to do a little research, and I came across a program called Cahoots, and it's out of Eugene, Oregon, and it's been around for over 30 years. I think that they just passed their 30-year mark. But basically what it is a response team or group that deals with issues related to mental health issues. And so what happens is, if there is a situation, if it was this gentleman, that someone could call a separate number and ask for dispatch. And there's a team of 2 people that pull up to the scene, and they have a van full of equipment from clothes to Tylenol to a soap, anything that anyone may need that is in a crisis. And they basically have conversations with them and try to assist and aid them in their time of need. And I'd listened to a podcast of one of the ladies who has been working there for a while, and she talked about a situation where she pulled up on a lady, and the lady was actually talking to a tree. And so she assessed the situation, talked to the lady, and she realized that there was no harm needed. The lady didn't need any additional work or help. She didn't want that help. And so what she basically did was left her with a resource, with a number. And I oftentimes think about what would happen if an armed officer in a uniform with a gun showed up to that scene. And so I'm not gonna talk very long, but what I would just say is that we have to keep in mind that public safety does not mean police. Public safety is not policing. And public safety is basically making sure that people's basic needs are being met. And when we look at what our police officers respond to, and in the situations, police very often stop violence from happening. They very often stop these situations from occurring. They usually come on the scene, on the back end of things, and creating more harm. And so I would just like to leave that with you all. But again, the name of the program is Cahoots. And I am very excited that you all have used your platform to have these conversations, because it is very important that we start to really reimagine what public safety means, what that means for us here in Louisville. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Keturah. That's helpful to get some really specific examples. I appreciate that. Our fourth conversation leader is Rashaad Abdur-Rahman, the founder and CEO of the Racial Healing Project. Rashaad is a social worker and behavioral health professional with experience in leadership, education, and community service. He's worked to lead citywide efforts to reduce community violence, promote racial equity, support youth, and center responses to trauma. Rashaad founded the Racial Healing Project to provide anti-racist training and strategic planning. Thank you, Rashaad.
Thank you. Thank you. It's wonderful being here with you all tonight. I'm honored to be in the presence of people that I admire so deeply, and drinking from the fountain of their knowledge and experiences is a gift for me, and to have so much respect and admiration for the other panelists. And Keturah set me up perfectly. Nice alley-oop, because she was sharing that we need to rethink what we mean by public safety. And I will tell you, when you hear elected officials, probably besides Charles and Attica and others, but when you hear most elected officials talk about public safety, they're talking about police, fire, and EMS. That's what they mean. And so when they articulate that 50% of our budget is invested in public safety, what they mean is that 50% of your tax dollars are invested in funding police departments and jails. And so if you're okay with that, and if that mirrors your values, then there's probably not much for you on this call. But I assume we're here because that doesn't vibe with your values, and because you feel that investing, let's see, $190 million in the police department and another $80 million in the jail probably isn't in line with our values. Now, here's a trip. We're in the middle of a global pandemic, and our public health department has about $20 million. Kind of strange to me, but that's where we are. And so when we talk about public safety, what really keeps us safe are having a living wage, having affordable housing, having access to fresh food and green spaces, having access to quality healthcare, quality mental health care. These are the things that produce public safety in our communities. And it's interesting that we're talking about violent policing, because police are the only institution that gets to enter a scenario with a gun and the legal authority to use it. And so policing by definition is violence. There isn't such a thing as nonviolent policing. Policing always enters violence into the equation. And so it's just important that as we're talking tonight, we recognize that by virtue of police being present, violence is present, and the authorization of violence by the state is present. We understand the history of policing. We understand that policing emerged from slave patrols with the sole duty of maintaining control of Black Americans and continuing the persecution and elimination of the indigenous peoples of this country, particularly in the South and Southwest. So fundamentally, there's a real danger when we talk about police reform. It's a very dangerous idea. Because policing, we can look at Minneapolis, for example. Policing, they've been trying to reform their police department since 1863, which was about 157 years ago by my math. And so it's very difficult to imagine that after 157 years of trying to reform a police department, In 2020, the same institution murders George Floyd over a counterfeit $20 bill. And so to what extent is police reform realistic? And the danger in that idea is that it continues to perpetuate moderate ideas that are just a softer kind of white supremacy. And so I think what we're saying is we're not really interested in various versions of white supremacy. We're actually interested in eliminating it completely. And so we understand, again, that real public safety is about meeting our basic human needs in a compassionate way, in a holistic way, in a comprehensive way. We could do a lot with $190 million, y'all, if we were diverting that towards public health or towards youth services, towards family support, a real affordable housing trust fund, things of that nature. So we have to reconceptualize where we want investments in public safety to be. Part of our conversation tonight, at least I think it needs to be, how we continuously reduce resources that are dedicated for police and invest those resources elsewhere, ultimately abolishing the idea of policing totally, because police don't keep us safe. There isn't any data to confirm that policing actually reduces crime. As Keturah said, police show up after the fact. Clearance rates for murder are typically very low in cities. And when folks are apprehended for murder, we understand that confessions are often forced. So there's very little evidence that policing solves crimes, prevents crime, or reduces crime in major cities. And the final piece I'll say is that policing as we know it cannot exist without the implicit and explicit consent of white people. Policing as an institution is in place to maintain whiteness and the privileges associated with whiteness. And so the consent of white people in the way police institutions operate in our country fundamentally keeps it in place. And so the work here is for our white communities to say we are done with the way policing operates, and we are interested in zeroing out these police budgets and investing them where our values are aligned.
Thank you very much. We are going to move now to groups, and Andrew will take us through that process. Thank you.
Thanks, Carolyn. And I want to thank each of our panelists for what you've brought to the conversation. I feel that the insights complemented each other in really marvelous ways. Just to share a few of my notes from what we just heard, Chandra told us that alternatives to violent policing begin with concrete practices of community building, with building trust and building networks of mutual aid and support in our communities. Charles tells us that we have to understand policing in context of a broader system of education, healthcare, and disparities rooted in centuries of white supremacy. Keturah shows us that alternative to violent policing might involve calling public health workers who are not armed and primed to escalate situations, and that public safety starts with meeting basic needs. Rashaad takes the alley-oop and helps us to move beyond a softer kind of white supremacy, but in eliminating it, in part by reducing resources dedicated to police and reinvesting our dollars and efforts to care for people with a view, ultimately, to abolishing policing, an institution which began in slave patrols and has serviced white supremacy ever since. And he closed by saying that in order to do that, one of the things that has to happen is that white people have to withdraw our consent. Moving forward in our next segment, I'd like to invite us to build on these insights in conversation together. So we're going to be moving to breakout rooms. Our tech hosts are basically going to, okay, I want to welcome everybody back. I hope that everybody's breakout room was just as generative and insight-filled as the one that I was fortunate to take part in. We're going to wrap up now, and there's a question that I'd like to raise to you, and I'm just going to put it in the chat, and then invite y'all to share in the chat. And the question is this. It's kind of a practical question as we move forward. The question is, what is one thing that I or we can do differently And we don't have, unfortunately, the time tonight to share that question aloud. But if anything, based on your conversations, based on what you heard tonight, based on what's swirling around within you, comes to mind, a concrete step that you might be able to take forward tonight, please share that, and please share it in the chat. These conversations are building from one to the next, and our hope is to join in a concerted and practical effort to, in fact, reimagine policing in our city, and we're laying the groundwork for that in conversation tonight. As folks are going through and responding to that question about what we might do differently, I'd like to invite each of our conversation leaders, if you would, to just share one final thought. And we're a little bit ahead of schedule, so don't feel constrained. If there's anything that you'd like to share based on what happened in your breakout group, or based on just the general tenor of the discussion tonight. So I suppose we could just go in the order that the presenters observed. So Chandra, Charles, Keturah, and Rashaad.
Can you say one more time what you would like me to share?
Just if there's a final thought that you'd like to leave with the group tonight.
That I'm glad you're here, and that I'm so happy to be with this group of presenters or panelists. And it just gives me a lot of hope that, you know, people from across the board are starting to have these conversations, because the more you get familiar and comfortable with having these conversations, and more knowledgeable in practice and also in theory, the more that'll spill into your interactions with people you know. And then the conversations and actions will be carried forward from there. But I also really encourage you to take this beyond theory and into practice. And often that looks really messy and really uncomfortable. And I'm just saying to do it anyway.
Thank you very much for that thought, Chandra. Charles, would you like to share something?
Certainly. I got a lot out of this conversation. I'm thankful for it. Thankful for all of the people that are bringing their transparency, vulnerability to this conversation. I think some top points that we got out of the breakout, and also listening to some of the comments from my fellow panelists before, is what it means to fully fund public safety and completely reimagine how we deal with regulations and what policing means, and the fact that we can go away from this current model of policing, not at the expense of having responses in times of crisis, but in fact making sure we have more and more holistic responses so that we can keep everyone safe, and understanding how we have, because we have perpetuated and fortified white supremacy, we have essentially allowed our governments to protect it by militarizing our public services. So our law enforcement component is militarized, and the whole dynamic of breaking out of that framework and not having communities feel like they are treated as enemy combatants, but as human beings, is a part of our healing. And the last point I think was important is that we're all talking about what it means to be safe and secure. And that's a common bond, and it's something we all want, and we can reorient our priorities so that we can all meet that, and Louisville deserves it.
Indeed, well spoken, and happy belated birthday, by the way. Keturah?
Yes, thank you all for having me. This was very fruitful for me. I love being in space where I can be a teacher and a student, and so I definitely learned a lot. And one of the things that I would just like to just reiterate and leave is that the choices people make are shaped by the choices that people have. And when we look at what Black people in Louisville, or Black Kentuckians, Black folks across the nation, we just have to keep in mind that just keep in mind that those choices are made by what they have. And then I had another thing that I was going to say and it just lost me. Yeah, I will leave. Oh, the other thing, Chandra hit on it as well, about practice, that the things that we want to see, it's up to us as individuals to practice that and in order for it to change. And it was lifted up in our group that having some of these conversations with some of our peers is very difficult. Some people don't get it. And so what I would also like to offer is to make sure that you're pouring into young people. I think our younger generation, they're ready for change. They know that we need change. They may not know and understand all of the historical context. And so each of us on this call is a huge resource, especially some of our older folks on the call. So I would just, offer to you to really pour into the young people in your network, just about your life experiences around different injustices that you've seen or witnessed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Keturah. And finally, Rashaad.
Sure. This has been a phenomenal dialogue, and I think it's important that we think about the myth of policing. Our limited perspective, our limited concept of public safety is not by accident. We've been indoctrinated by a myth of policing. Some of my favorite movies, Beverly Hills Cop, Die Hard, Lethal Weapon, these are all movies about police officers in some shape, form, or another. And this isn't by accident. This mythology of policing actually extends beyond our conscious awareness into our subconscious. And fundamentally, the work is to shift our paradigm at an emotional and internalized level. We need to understand that we've been conditioned to think that policing is the only choice and the only option. I think Chandra spoke to this. We've ignored mutual aid opportunities. And so as a result of that, our fear, and again, we're operating out of a fear paradigm. Our fear is that if I don't have a police officer, I don't have anything. So this monster is better than nothing, or this monstrous potential is better than nothing. And it's not about good people or bad people. I shared in my group that I know a lot of police officers, but I know people who put on a badge and wear a uniform that are good people. But they are in an institution designed to produce the kind of outcomes we are seeing. So it's really about shifting our paradigm and shifting what's possible. But certainly the myth of policing is the greatest story ever told, and we have to interrogate that myth. We have to interrogate that story. Fundamentally, and I have a lot of white friends who over the past months have reached out and asked me, what can I do? How can I get involved? What can I do? And for me, this is the civil and social rights issue of our time, is police brutality, is defunding and abolishing policing. And so fundamentally, and again, whiteness is centered in terms of what policing is in place to protect. And so I want to be really clear in saying that white folks have a clear responsibility to galvanize other white folks into abolishing police. I want you all to become police abolitionists. That's what I want. You want to know what you can do? I want you all to become police abolitionists tonight, and get to work in defunding the Louisville Police Department.
Great. So I'm going to kind of close us out by thanking one more time our special conversation leaders and each of you who have participated. Just personally, looking back, I think it is kind of amazing that we're having this discussion, because it seems like only a few months ago the idea of defund the police became mainstream and everyone was like, what? And now people are having realistic discussions about what that will look like. And abolish ICE, has become more mainstream. And And hopefully this is a wave that is going to move forward to do what we're talking about. So we will be meeting again on November the 12th at 7 p.m. There is a registration we'll be sending out to everyone who is on our list, or if you know anyone else who wants to join us. And hopefully we'll be getting even more specific on actionable items at that time. So thanks again for being here tonight. Good night, everyone.